For today, as you can see, highly declarative UI without using templates. What is it? I mean, in other words, what is this trying to tell you is that I will show you different way how UI can be built today in order to give you all the freedom, and so you can actually write way less code with way more consistency. Because this is what we want, because we don't want to actually produce way too much code because we have to maintain all of this, right? And I will start with setting up some context. I will try to tell you why another library, where we are coming from and what we are trying to solve. And then once we understand this, we will actually jump into look at some of the features, what it can do for us. And of course, today we will have 2 demos. So let's start. How many of you here works for larger corporation that has 2 or 3 plus UI team that actually develops UI? You are a little bit bigger, even 2 departments. No big companies here? Okay. Anyway, so it's okay. But at least we all work on Angular, right? Okay, which is... So whether you work for a bigger company or small company, we always write some software that is either for internal use or for external use. Whether it's 1 application or 50 application, it's a lot of code. And what we try to accomplish, we try to reduce the minimize number of code, and when we have more team, we try to somehow synchronize the kind of work so we don't actually duplicate and we don't actually repeat ourselves. Therefore, even if you work for a company that has well-defined set of components that you try to use to build your UI, where you already jump all the way up to abstract the way that you don't work anymore with CSS HTML, you wrap all those things into well-defined components, and you can have those to write different UIs. Let's say we will be writing UI for CRM and invoicing. It's still a lot of code to write, because if you look at this example where I just put together a few lines of code, I'm not sure whether you guys see it in the back, is that I'm using Angular material where I just assemble 4 fields to represent user profile. To represent user profile, it's a lot of line of code. And if you think of it, that if I have to write the same amount of line of code, not only 4 but 20 fields that I need to represent for all those other domain entities, let's say not only user permissions and groups, purchase order, invoice, requisition, receipt, you can name it. It's a lot of code, and I will try to repeat myself a lot of times so we'll actually remember what we're trying to solve, is that even this might look okay, but in the long run is not, because we will have to take care of it. We will have to actually keep enhancements. We'll try to fix some issues. And at the end, if we try to maybe put some new feature in, let's say put some extra binding in the input, I will have to update every single place I will actually use this code. That's why what I'm trying to show you is that really how we can simplify the UI development in the way that I don't write all those lines, I don't actually try to repeat myself, and we let something that we call rule engine, that we call also MetaUI, that is actually using rules that are really similar like CSS rules to generate the user interface for us. And once we have all this, then the main motivation behind all this is really try to solve the big problem, because everything starts and ends with our domain entities or objects, for which we try to generate user interface. And of course, our entities appear under different contexts, under different UI, meaning that when I actually write code, not only I write certain form for editing, I need to actually write the same thing for read only. And at the same time, I need to write the same thing for create, right? Because most likely, when I'm creating objects, there might be a different set of fields as compared to editing or viewing, right? So all of this comes down to the solution where we try to simplify all this with something called MetaUI, which is a rule engine that sits on the front-end side, that has set of APIs and minimum set of components, that has, or that can actually take your model, described by metadata that we call rules, once again, like OSS or CSS rules, in order to derive fully functional user interface for you on the fly without using templates and forcing you assemble and lay out every single field on the page over and over. Because as you saw 2 slides back, we can have as many as much reusable components in our repository, but still we have to actually, when we are assembling, take this component, put it into the template, put this component, put it into the template to assemble the actual structure. And this is what we are trying to avoid. So this is short introduction, and let me show you first demo. Oh, I still have features. So not so fast. So now let me tell you what it can do for us. So MetaUI is based on the DRY principle. Since we try to declare everything and define everything on the global level, we don't try to repeat ourselves. So where in the first place, when I try to lay out those components manually, I do a lot of repetitions. With this, we try to avoid this because it's declared only once and some other logic is able to generate the whole UI for us. I think I already mentioned this one before. MetaUI is heavily motivated by CSS, meaning just like CSS rules are additive, meaning more common rules can be overwritten by more specific rules. The same things works here, which actually give us great capability in terms of customization. So if you need customization framework and you don't want to actually create multiple GitHub repository because you always make some adjustments for different customer, this is the framework for you. Because just like CSS, we can have a bootstrap at the bottom, right? We can actually have some company layer that actually defines some additional styles. And then even on application level, you as a developer, you are able to tweak it. So this is the power. We don't actually realize that we are able to use CSS to shape the way our HTML is rendered. Even one would think it's actually different UI. And this is what we are trying to achieve as well. I think it was like 5 or 6 months back, we finally refactor a whole this rule engine so you can actually plug in your own UI library, because before it was purely based on something called PrimeNG. It was 1 by 1, but we realized if we want to actually open source it, then there is no other way to show it, to present it, because nobody would care if you are not able to plug in your UI library, because every single company is using something different. Of course, it needs to be on Angular. And what it would be on the enterprise level, just like I already mentioned this as well, is we do need to support different modes, because when we assemble the UI differs whether I'm showing to the user for read only, or he's editing, or he's creating, or I'm listing list of objects. For each of these situations, I need to be able to define different set of user interfaces. And on an enterprise level, when we have all these tweaks and then to adjust it and maybe show different UI for different customers, we need some conditional support, some expression. So I want to be able to define that, hey, make this field visible if something, or make this field editable if something else. And using this, I'm able to redefine the complete user interface based on certain conditional statement, dynamic expression that can be actually defined directly in the rules, just like you will see, or they can be actually defined in some other logic. Now, finally the demo. Since we don't want to wait for npm install, I ran these 3 commands before I went here. And as you know, if you work on Angular side, I do nothing else than create new Angular project. Then I will add my rules using schematics, and I will generate one simple page which will work through the demo. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me sit down. Switch. I'll close this one. As you will see, this is a regular Angular project. The only things that differs, I have one view here called member details that will generate different kinds of forms in different modes. Let's make it simple. And what you see here is that I have my controller here called member detail components TypeScript class, where does nothing else, where I just instantiate this my domain entity. For simplicity, I just instantiate these things here because otherwise you will have to try to load it from somewhere else, right? And here, this is my template, where we don't need to go into too much details right now, but the only things here to remember is that, hey, can you render this object for me for operation edit and for layout that I call inspect? And I don't want to worry about anything right now. When I run this, then you'll see out of nothing that it will, let me check whether it works. Okay. It will generate this UI without me doing almost anything. And when I actually go back and maybe change this to view because I want to show it in read-only mode, go back, it's read-only. And I haven't done anything on the controller. I haven't done anything on the template class. All those things are generated. But now, what if I want to a little bit modify it, make it better, because my bio, just like description about the user, it's a simple input field. I want to make it text area because you want to write something and it'll reorganize this. So what I want to do, I will use this intelligent template, save it. We will get back to those rules as well. Right now, it's what it can do for us. So one is actually compiles, and I will refresh my page, and I will go back into edit. Then what will happen is that all of a sudden my UI changes. This is text area. I have my data. I can actually select. This is number. Everything is recognized. This is select. Everything's fine. When I go back to view, it needs to work as well. So what I did is I use a few selectors, because just like in CSS, we have selectors that can be nested, and we have properties, nothing else. This is how you should see it, but we will actually review the OSS language in the next few slides, don't worry. But I don't actually like this view because it's one column, so let me change it a little bit. I have these little 2 steps to make the things easier, because I try to figure out how to use different shortcuts to actually generate different UI, and I define a few, but then I got lost completely. So I just use the most simplistic method when I actually have certain steps. So what happens now, the only things I did, I just use another property to send a few fields to different zones, right? Because my layout contains 5 different zones: top, left, right, bottom. And what I do, I just assign certain properties, and something else is able to reassemble everything. Oops. And reorganize my view into different columns. And of course, if I double check view edit, then nothing should break, and it's more organized, and I'm pretty happy. So we just saw, let me go back into presentation. Let me start it. So we just saw how easy it is to generate UI out of nothing. I haven't changed, I haven't touched my template, I haven't touched my controller. The only things I was playing with is just a few rules, just like you would actually tweak your CSS to shape the way your HTML looks on the screen. The most important part, just like if you remember that when I said this framework is heavily motivated by CSS, is the way we actually use the rules to render the UI. If you look at this simple example, where we have div that it has class with shape, right? It's called shape, and on the other side we have simple rules, and when the first rules is matched, of course, what happened? We will render this rectangle. When the second rule is matched, we will render cycle. It's clear, right? Because if I render the same code on the smaller device, some other rules takes control and overrides whatever was defined on the top level, and this is simple. Everybody understands this, right? And the important part is that when the browser is reading our HTML and tries to match CSS again and try to find the best selector, he's trying to use every information he can find. Not only, hey, I have a class that is within the concept of div, and I have div which is within the concept of body. And he's trying to use all this information, also information which is given to him by environment, like what is my browser width, what is my locale, and so on, so on. And he used this all information to generate the UI. MetaUI is somewhat similar, where we do not ask browser to give us all these environment properties. We are one step ahead. So we say, hey, this is here is the class called user, here's the operation edit, and here's the layout, and I can keep adding key value pair as I want. And he uses all this information, try to actually match the best rule available to generate the different UI. And just like in first example, when I say operation edit, there is some global rule that says if operation edit makes something visible, and something else can actually read this property and do something. In the second example, when I have please change it to view, then I have somewhere different rule that modifies the behavior and says visible false, which hides the control or whatever I'm hiding on the page. As you see here, CSS is really similar to OSS. Even I say here CSS, but it looks more like SES, but I still keep the CSS because it was original idea behind it. Just like you read here, when you actually see dot shape, you already know it's class equal shape, right? If you see hash key something, you know it's like ID equals. This is the way we should read OSS as well. We are more descriptive, but the only things you should actually focus on is that set of selectors and list of properties that I can actually put in, nothing else. Just like CSS or SES or any other preprocessing language, I can write those rules in nested way, and I can actually write them inline, or I can actually do combination of both. This is the same, right? Again, selectors, properties. This is how we should read it. When we define properties, we support different set of types and values. We can do boolean, strings, maps, array, JavaScript expression, you name it. When you have, I would say, a larger project and you try to reuse as much as you can, we have these things called traits, which is a feature which is able to add additional behavior to your existing rules. Just like we use mixing, just like we use traits in C#, is the same thing. Because if I want to say that, hey, when I have a password field under a user, I don't want to really show it, so I just want to actually create special component for it. And my goal is not to redefine this set of rules on the left for every single use case, because I have two different rules. Because if there is a password, I set a component password field and also put some additional validation behind it. Plus I set require true, which puts the asterisk next to the field, right? But since I want to do it for every single use case, I just want to define a trait, then I can actually really use it with easy, where I just say trade is required or secret, and I can actually add as many trade I can, just like you keep adding different mixins to CSS or says, right? And this way you can actually reuse a lot of things which could be defined on the global application level, and application developers doesn't have to worry about too much things. When we are rendering fields out of certain entity, either on enterprise or non-enterprise level, sometimes we have a need that not every single field needs to exist on the entity. Sometimes we have derived field, how we call it, or calculated fields, or ad hoc fields, which is a field which is just made up, and it can be some method or function behind it, actually assemble something, or I can just do expression directly in the rules to describe something. I just don't have exact example right now, but just imagine you just try to render an invoice. You have only, you store only amount and VAT, and maybe you don't want to hard code it. You want to retrieve the VAT based on user OK or country, and you want to calculate it on the fly. But this field, amount with VAT doesn't exist in database, but you can actually made it up, right? Now we will actually take our example to the next level. We will actually do a few additional features, and we will actually use some additional advanced techniques from the MetaUI to actually enhance our form. Let me close this. Okay, what I want to do now, since I change the layout, I modify a few properties, I move the bio, I mean the description at the bottom. Now I want to enhance it a little bit more, where I have this code here, which I will replace my template, as you see, because I don't want to really keep going back and forth and try to, the front view always rename, view, edit, and so on. I just want to actually automate it. And I want to go into my thing. I have this little field. The default operation is edit. So this is first thing. I just want to check I have those buttons. Okay, everything works. Perfect. And the next things, which is okay. And then, as you will see in a minute, oops. What I have added right now, everything works fine. Okay, save, oops, refresh. Okay, just want to make sure that our button works. Now, I will add some additional rules, which adds conditional statement into the bio, because I don't want to make this bio editable if something, for example, if you use, it's kind of stupid use case, but I just want to show you that it works, is that what I want to have, I want to define a condition using expression that I want to make this field editable if user is older than 18, right? And the same way, what I can do is when user is less than 18, the field is read only, all is dynamic, and I don't actually allow him to type anything. When user is 23, I can keep editing, right? And this way, I can really write those expressions directly in the code, into rules, or I can actually redirect them into some TypeScript class or service. The same way, I can actually hide and show fields, right? The same things as I made it visible, editable, I can dynamically play with the fields and hide them and show them based on the same condition, right? So if I go here, the field is not visible, I can hide it dynamically, but only things I do, I just add and remove certain properties just like we do this with CSS. The good things about this is that you can really lay out different rules on top of each other, because as I said, it's additive just like CSS is. So usually the way companies use it, especially the main sponsor here, SAP Ariba, is we have rules on complete bottom level, which is the rules which actually define if number, use this component. If view, then you'd use this float of layout. But then on the application level, we have the same set of rules. And then developer always, for specific case, for specific customer, can tweak it as well. Meaning, for example, if I'm showing this rule for role, let's say admin, I can actually define this is role admin, and I can actually redefine the rule completely and show this user something else, or make validation completely different. And the same things, if I show this UI for customer A, I can actually render him different set of UIs than to customer B. This gives me, just like CSS, great capability of manipulating the UI without even touching the template. So I have visible the same things. Validity rules is validity rule is pretty fancy. Let me check. I just deleted it. The good thing is we're actually using IntelliJ IDEA. Then we can actually go back to history. History doesn't have anything, which is great. Don't worry. Since I keep copying these things, then I have this condition here, because what I want to do, I will close this. I can actually redefine a validity condition for age, because if you are less than 15, I want to actually create validation error, right? And this validation nicely translates into Angular forms into validators as well. So when I actually write simple expression like this, of course, I can actually do it in the code, or some other service can retrieve it. This automatically translates into Angular, and Angular set up some validator behind it, and this message will appear. So let me save this. I hope it's the right file. And I try to enter invalid value, and all of a sudden you see I have visibility still there as well, which is confusing, hiding and showing. But what you can see, I can actually nicely integrate with Angular validators, right? And the message which I define is shown on the screen. I'm actually using Angular material to show the errors, but if I type the right number, everything's fine. Once again, if we review how many things we touch or change, we haven't touched any of the logic here. We just edited buttons. We just commented the edit, but we haven't added any additional code to create, let me delete this, I don't like this one, to create this simple or advanced additional logic to generate the UI. 2 columns, organize the field just like I want based on the specification, do different validation or different conditional statement, whether I want to make this field visible, editable, and there can be different conditions, right? Then, as I told you, that sometimes we have fields that we call derived, that something is made up, then I can do the same things here. If I add additional field, you know what, I will show you this one, this is better, is that how easy for me is to add, for example, a hint. Again, adding hint is just adding properties. And since every single property is backed up by expression, so it can be any types like boolean, list, array, and the same things here, I just added a hint into my bio, and I can keep writing, and you see how many characters I type. And again, the only things I add, I just added additional properties, nothing else. And you would have to actually implement those logic behind it, you would have to maintain it, and so on. Now, finally, here it comes, my derive field, something ad hoc that doesn't exist on the actual object, because what I want to do, I want to create my own made up field, and I want to actually use the values from the existing objects, and I want to actually ship it to the top zone, which means if everything works, I don't need this title because I already made up my own title, which is dynamic, right? Let me save this. I have my title, and of course it's read only, right? And I can actually create different kinds of ad hoc field for any kinds of the entity. Now we always talk about different layouts because it's super important when I actually work with domain objects and I have different business logic. It's to have ability to define different layout based on different operation. So I can reorganize my existing rules where the top part will be just used to declare things and to define the core properties, and the bottom part I will use to lay out my components. Just like I use to lay out my own components using properties, hey, after zone top, zone left, I have different, more advanced way of doing this, which is kind of easier for me to read, where I just use, hey, when you actually render anything for member, operation, view, and edit, organize those fields this way. But for operation create, make sure you organize those fields this way and only use those 4 fields instead of everything. So if I compile this, for view, edit, I have the same thing, but for create, it's completely different UI, right? And usually this costs me 3 different templates and maybe 3 different routings to be able to do this. And this, I have it for free. And if I go back to presentation and run it again. So right now, you just saw how pretty straightforward and easy it is to generate UI really out of nothing. And we just touched the small part of what MetaUI can do. Because MetaUI has 4 main major concepts that deal with fields, classes, layouts, and modules. And we just touched classes and fields. Even I use the inspect layout, which is somehow defined behind the scenes, but we haven't seen anything like this because I haven't shown you. But layout, what it can do is basically define structure. For example, I can actually create my own stack layout when I can actually combine actions and form together, right? Using the rules. Again, the HTML template that defines the contents is identical. Or I can actually do more advanced examples where I can actually create my own complete custom layout, which contains with several expandable sections, and my form can be actually spread out into multiple sections, and I can do whatever I want, right? And of course, modules is something that can actually define a page. So when we have several modules, it was always meant to create the top level navigation menu, and once you actually click on something, you get to some landing page, and every single portlet you see here is made up from some layout as well. So MetaUI, the way we see it, is really powerful language, but sometimes using it adds some additional abstraction to the application, so we need to be careful when and how we use it. But at the end of the day, we try to save our time and the way we work with code, and we don't want to actually type too much, because the more code we write, we have to actually take care of it later on. We have to actually fix issues, we need to keep enhancing it, and the more code base the traditional approach where I'm assembling means just a lot of maintenance at the end. So, and this is MetaUI, which can actually help you solve the problem. And thank you.